December 5th, 1944, 1100 hours. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles, France. Senior staff officers stood around a situation map discussing not if Germany would surrender, but when. "I'd say Berlin by February," one colonel remarked. "March at the latest." Across the room, logistics officers debated post-war occupation zones. The German army was retreating. Allied momentum was unstoppable. Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower studied the same map with measured satisfaction. His vast coalition was holding together, pushing forward on all fronts. Victory felt inevitable. 550 kilometers to the southeast, in Nancy, France, General George S. Patton stood motionless before an identical map. But his expression carried no satisfaction, only the sharp focus of a man who saw something no one else could see. His intelligence officer had just delivered another report. Unusual German unit movements, radio silence in unexpected sectors, missing divisions. Patton turned to his staff. "They're not finished," he said quietly. "They're concentrating for something. And when they come, we need to be ready to move. Fast." 11 days later, the officers at Versailles would no longer be discussing post-war plans. Eisenhower would be facing the worst Allied crisis since D-Day. And Patton, the general who had prepared for a battle no one believed was coming, would execute a maneuver that military historians would call impossible. This is the story of how foresight defeated assumption, how one commander understood not just Germany's strength, but its desperation, and how that knowledge would transform Hitler's final gamble into his ultimate defeat. December 16th, 1944, 05:30 hours. The silence of the Ardennes forest exploded into chaos. 1,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously across an 80-kilometer front. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Hitler's last desperate counteroffensive, had begun. 25 divisions, 200,000 soldiers, 600 tanks, and 1,900 artillery pieces crashed into a front held by just 4 American divisions, most of them inexperienced or battle-worn. It was Germany's largest offensive in the West since 1940, and Hitler had chosen his ground carefully. The Ardennes, dense forests, narrow roads, brutal winter terrain, was the same region where German panzers had broken through 4 years earlier to deliver a knockout blow to France. Allied planners had considered this sector too difficult for large-scale armored operations. They had stationed their weakest units here to rest and refit. The 106th Infantry Division had been on the front for only 5 days. The 28th Division was recovering from savage fighting in the Hurtgen Forest. The first hours were catastrophic for the Americans. Units caught without warning fell back in confusion. Fog grounded all Allied aircraft. German armored spearheads punched deep into the front, some advancing 20 kilometers on the first day alone. Communications broke down. Entire battalions were cut off, surrounded, forced to surrender. In Berlin, cautious optimism became euphoria. Goebbels began drafting proclamations of a second Dunkirk. Wehrmacht generals who had been retreating for months suddenly spoke of reversing the tide of the war. But at Supreme Headquarters, the atmosphere was entirely different. Eisenhower immediately grasped what was happening. Germany had committed its last strategic reserves to a single, all-or-nothing offensive. This was not a diversion or a limited spoiling attack. It was a bet on total victory or total collapse. And so Eisenhower made the most critical decision of his command. On December 19th, he summoned his senior commanders to an emergency conference at Verdun. The Allied response would need to be immediate, massive, and perfectly coordinated. One general arrived at that meeting already prepared with answers. The plan for Germany's Ardennes offensive had been born months earlier in Hitler's headquarters. The plan for Germany's Ardennes offensive had been born months earlier in Hitler's headquarters. But to understand why it succeeded initially and failed ultimately, you must first understand the two men who would shape the Allied response. Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the largest multinational military force ever assembled. His responsibility wasn't simply to defeat Germany. It was to hold together a coalition of nations with competing interests, egos, and strategic priorities. British Field Marshal Montgomery wanted resources. French generals demanded recognition. American public opinion demanded results. Eisenhower's genius lay in balancing these pressures while maintaining forward momentum across a 1,000-kilometer front. His assessment of Germany in December 1944 was logical, evidence-based, and widely shared. German manpower was declining. Fuel shortages were crippling mobile operations. The Wehrmacht was retreating on multiple fronts, in the east, in Italy, in the west. Every intelligence metric pointed toward inevitable collapse. Germany was dying. It just didn't know it yet. George S. Patton saw the same data and reached a radically different conclusion. Patton had spent decades studying German military doctrine. He understood how German commanders thought, how they trained their officers, how they approached operational problems. Where Eisenhower managed a coalition and calculated logistical realities, Patton studied enemy psychology, and what he saw terrified him. German military tradition didn't favor cautious retreat. It favored the Kesselschlacht, the bold counterstroke, the sudden reversal, the attack when least expected. Cornered enemies don't always surrender. Sometimes they lash out with everything they have left, not because they can win, but because desperation erases caution. Eisenhower saw Germany weakening. Patton saw Germany becoming unpredictable. Within days, one of these interpretations would prove catastrophically accurate. The question was, which one? The Ardennes region of Belgium and Luxembourg was everything a military planner learns to avoid. Dense forests choked with undergrowth, roads so narrow that 2 trucks could barely pass, rivers cutting through steep valleys. In December, add freezing rain, fog, and snow that turned dirt tracks into impassable mud. Allied planners looked at this terrain and saw exactly what textbooks told them to see. Poor tank country, a logistical nightmare, terrain that favored defense over offense. The Ardennes had been quiet since Germany's 1940 breakthrough, a lightning strike that seemed like a historical anomaly, not a repeatable strategy. 4 years later, with Germany on the defensive and resources depleted, launching a major offensive through such difficult ground seemed absurd. So the Ardennes became a rest sector. The 106th Infantry Division, fresh from training in England, was sent there to gain quiet frontline experience. The 28th Division, shattered in the Hurtgen Forest, was positioned there to recover. Experienced units were needed elsewhere. The Ardennes could wait. Patton studied the same terrain and reached the opposite conclusion. He knew German military history. In 1940, they had attacked through the Ardennes precisely because it seemed impossible. In 1914, they had violated Belgian neutrality because others assumed they wouldn't, time and again. German operational doctrine chose audacity over predictability. The value of surprise, Patton understood, often outweighed the cost of difficult terrain. To Allied planners, the Ardennes was quiet because it was safe. To Patton, it was quiet because no one expected anything to happen there. And that was exactly what made it dangerous. By early December, His intelligence staff was reporting inconsistencies: missing German divisions, unexplained radio silence, supply movements that didn't match a defensive posture. The reports went to higher headquarters. They were noted, filed, dismissed. The Ardennes remained quiet. But silence, Patton knew, was not the same as safety. Colonel Oscar Koch, Patton's intelligence chief, was not a man given to speculation. He dealt in facts, patterns, and probabilities. In early December 1944, the facts disturbed him. German units that had been identified on the Eastern Front were disappearing from reports. Radio traffic in the Eifel region, directly east of the Ardennes, had gone conspicuously silent. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were increasing over what was supposed to be a quiet sector. Prisoner interrogations mentioned whispers of a coming offensive, though no one could say where or when. Koch compiled his findings and sent them up the intelligence chain. The response from higher headquarters was polite skepticism. Germany was retreating everywhere. These movements were probably defensive repositioning, perhaps preparation for a local spoiling attack at most. Nothing to warrant alarm. Patton's response was different. He didn't panic, didn't demand immediate action. He simply turned to his staff and said, "Plan for it." What followed was quiet, methodical, and invisible to outside observers. Staff officers analyzed road networks north of Third Army's current position. Which routes could handle armored columns in winter? How many vehicles per hour? Fuel officers calculated consumption rates for a 90-degree turn of the entire army. Ammunition officers mapped supply points. No orders were issued, no units were moved. But the blueprint was drawn. Patton wasn't predicting the future. He was ensuring readiness. There's a crucial difference. If Germany attacked through the Ardennes, the Allied response would need to be immediate and massive. There would be no time for staff officers to huddle over maps, debating options, calculating logistics. Decisions would need to be made in minutes, not days. Patton couldn't be certain Germany would strike. But he was absolutely certain that if it did, hesitation would be catastrophic. On December 15th, his planning was complete. The next morning, theory became reality. Dawn came late to the Ardennes on December 16th. Thick fog blanketed the forest. American soldiers in their frozen foxholes could barely see 30 meters ahead. At 0530 hours, the world exploded. 1,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously. Shells screamed through the fog, obliterating command posts, severing communication lines, turning quiet crossroads into infernos. Before anyone could react, German infantry emerged from the tree line, shadowy figures in white winter camouflage, advancing in waves. Then came the tanks. Entire American companies found themselves surrounded within hours. Green troops from the 106th Division, who had never faced combat, surrendered in battalion-strength groups. Veterans from the 28th Division fought desperately, but were overwhelmed by sheer force. The fog that blanketed the battlefield grounded every Allied aircraft. There would be no air support, no reconnaissance, no visibility beyond the chaos at ground level. By noon, German armored spearheads had punched 20 kilometers into American lines. By nightfall, the situation had deteriorated from crisis to catastrophe. At Supreme Headquarters, the confidence that had defined early December evaporated. Eisenhower faced a nightmare scenario. The Allied front was buckling, potentially splitting into isolated pockets. If German forces reached the Meuse River and pushed beyond, British and American armies could be cut off from each other entirely. Coalition unity, the foundation of everything Eisenhower had built, was suddenly at stake. This was no spoiling attack. no local diversion. Germany had committed its final strategic reserves to a single, desperate offensive. Hitler was gambling everything on one throw of the dice. The war everyone thought was nearly won had just become terrifyingly uncertain. The question was no longer when Germany would surrender. The question was whether the Allies could stop disaster before it became irreversible. Time was running out. On December 19th, Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to an emergency conference in Verdun, a city whose name still echoed with the ghosts of World War I's bloodiest stalemate. The atmosphere was tense. The German offensive was 3 days old and showing no signs of slowing. Allied forces were retreating. The situation demanded immediate, decisive action. Eisenhower opened the meeting by insisting on optimism, but his face betrayed the gravity of the crisis. He needed solutions, and he needed them now. When he turned to Patton and asked when Third Army could counterattack into the southern flank of the German advance, the room went silent. December 22nd, Patton replied without hesitation. 3 divisions. Several officers exchanged skeptical glances. Patton's army was currently fighting southward, engaged in operations near the Saar. To disengage, turn 90 degrees north, and attack through winter roads in 48 hours seemed impossible. But Patton wasn't guessing. He had already done the math. While others scrambled to understand the crisis, Patton's staff had spent days preparing for exactly this scenario. Route assignments were ready. Fuel calculations were complete. Movement orders were drafted. All that remained was authorization. More importantly, Patton understood something others had not yet grasped. Germany's offensive was tactically brilliant, but strategically doomed. The attack depended entirely on speed, captured fuel supplies, and perfect timing. Every day Germany advanced stretched its logistics thinner. Every mile forward consumed irreplaceable reserves. If the Allies struck hard and fast into the German flank, the entire offensive would collapse under its own weight. Eisenhower studied Patton for a moment, then nodded. Make it so. The decision had been made. Third Army would pivot north and counterattack. Everything now depended on whether Patton's preparation could match the speed Germany's desperation demanded. The fate of the Western Front hung on the answer. What Patton promised at Verdun, his army delivered in the snow. On December 22nd, exactly when promised, the 4th Armored Division smashed into the southern shoulder of the German advance near Ardennes. Behind them came the 26th and 80th Infantry Divisions, grinding northward through ice-covered roads toward the surrounded town of Bastogne. The maneuver was staggering in scope. Over 130,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and thousands of tons of supplies turned 90 degrees and attacked through some of the worst winter conditions Europe had seen in decades. Convoys stretched for miles. Tanks slipped on frozen roads. Fuel trucks struggled through snowdrifts. Nothing about the operation was perfect, but speed mattered more than perfection, because by December 22nd, the cracks in Germany's offensive were already showing. Fuel shortages were crippling panzer divisions that had advanced beyond their supply lines. The Luftwaffe, which had briefly dominated foggy skies, was now overwhelmed as weather cleared and Allied air power returned in force. German spearheads, stretched dangerously thin, found themselves isolated, unable to reinforce or resupply. Patton had understood from the beginning. Time was the real battlefield. Germany's offensive was a race against its own logistical collapse. Every hour the Allies delayed their response, gave Germany another hour to consolidate gains. But every hour Germany failed to reach its objectives, the Meuse River crossings, the fuel depots at Spa, brought it closer to exhaustion. Patton's counterattack struck precisely where Germany could least afford it, at the base of the advance, threatening to cut off the entire offensive from behind. German commanders, who days earlier had spoken confidently of reaching Antwerp, now faced a terrible realization. They were running out of time, fuel, and options. The momentum of the war was shifting. The question was whether it had already shifted too late for Germany to recover. By Christmas Day, the German offensive was dying from within. The weather that had shielded Germany's initial assault, fog, snow, heavy clouds, finally broke. Clear skies returned to the Ardennes, and with them came Allied air power in overwhelming force. Thousands of fighter bombers and medium bombers descended on German columns, turning roads into graveyards of burning vehicles. Supply convoys that had barely managed to crawl forward now couldn't move at all. The fuel crisis became catastrophic. Panzer divisions that had spearheaded the advance sat immobilized, out of gas, unable to retreat or reinforce. Captured American fuel depots, which German planners had counted on, had been destroyed or evacuated before they could be seized. Artillery units rationed shells. Infantry fought without proper support. Worse than the material collapse was the psychological one. German officers who had believed they were executing a war-winning offensive now found themselves fighting in isolation, cut off from higher command, surrounded by enemies on multiple sides. The confidence that had driven the attack evaporated. Units that had advanced with swagger now retreated in exhaustion. SS commanders who had mocked American resilience now faced a counteroffensive that refused to stop. Patton had been right from the beginning. Germany's gamble had always been about speed: strike fast, advance deep, reach the Meuse before the Allies could react. Every element of the plan depended on perfect timing and flawless execution. Germany had achieved neither. By late December, the Bulge in Allied lines, the furthest point of German penetration, began to shrink. American and British forces pressed from north and south. Patton's Third Army drove relentlessly toward Bastogne and beyond. The offensive was collapsing. But the cost of that collapse, for Germany, was about to become devastatingly clear. What had Hitler gambled? And what had he lost? On January 8, 1945, Hitler authorized the withdrawal. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last strategic gamble, was over. The cost was staggering and irreversible. Over 100,000 German casualties, nearly 800 tanks destroyed or abandoned, thousands of vehicles lost. Elite SS Panzer divisions reduced to hollow shells. Most critically, Germany had expended its final operational reserves, the last mobile forces capable of mounting any significant defense. Hitler had bet everything on a single throw of the dice. He had lost. The Battle of the Bulge revealed two fundamentally different ways of understanding the same enemy. Eisenhower, managing a vast coalition and multiple fronts, had seen Germany logically, as a weakening force in inevitable decline. His response to the crisis was masterful. He stabilized the front, coordinated a multinational counteroffensive, and held the Allied coalition together under extreme pressure. But Patton had seen something deeper. He understood that Germany's greatest danger came not from its strength, but from its desperation. A cornered enemy doesn't follow predictable patterns. It lashes out with everything it has left, not because victory is likely, but because surrender is unthinkable. That psychological insight, combined with rigorous preparation, allowed Patton to respond not just quickly, but decisively, striking at the exact moment Germany's timetable could least afford it. This is what Patton knew that others had missed. Wars are decided not only by measuring an enemy's strength, but by understanding what it will do when it has nothing left to lose. The war in Europe would continue for 4 more months, But Germany's fate was sealed in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, not by superior firepower alone, but by the foresight of a commander who prepared for disaster before anyone believed it could happen. In war, as in life, assumption feels safe until the moment it becomes fatal. Foresight, however uncomfortable, is what survives history's harshest tests. If this story of impossible odds, desperate decisions, and the words that defined legends moved you, subscribe to this channel now. We're bringing you the untold moments, the private words, and the human drama behind history's greatest battles. Hit that notification bell. Drop a comment about leadership under pressure, and share this with anyone who needs to hear about what's possible when someone refuses to accept defeat. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the most difficult people achieve the most extraordinary